They thought they could betray me and get away with it, but they had no idea what was coming next. Here's how I fought back, piece by piece, and reclaimed my life. My name's Mike, and for years, I thought I had the perfect marriage. My wife, Sarah, was someone I trusted completely. She was smart, driven, and had this charm that made her the center of any room she walked into. To be honest, I always felt like I was lucky to be with her. We were that couple people thought had it all together. My friends would sometimes joke that we were the ideal relationship, and I guess I let myself believe it. We had our ups and downs, but it always felt like we were solid. Or so I thought. Lately, though, I'd noticed little changes. Nothing major, just small things that made me pause. Sarah was suddenly working late a lot more, getting dressed up even on casual nights out, and always seemed glued to her phone. When I'd ask, she'd laugh it off, saying she was catching up with work or friends. I trusted her, so I let it slide. The weirdest part was that she'd been spending a lot of time with one of my closest friends, Jake. We were all pretty close, but I started noticing that they'd talk on the side more often, sharing inside jokes and stories. I figured it was just friendly banter. Jake and I had been friends for years. If there was anyone I trusted besides Sarah, it was him. But still, something felt off. Maybe it was nothing, I'd tell myself. Maybe I was just overthinking things. But looking back, those small suspicions were the beginning of something I never could have predicted. A few weeks went by, and that uneasy feeling kept growing. Sarah's late nights were becoming routine. She'd come home exhausted, often saying she'd been working overtime or meeting a friend, yet she'd never specify who that friend was. When I'd ask, she'd give vague answers or joke about how she was mysterious. Then there was Jake. He'd become oddly distant toward me, and I noticed him avoiding eye contact in conversations. When we'd all hang out together, he'd either be too friendly with Sarah or avoid her entirely, as if he couldn't decide how to act around us. It seemed strange, but I brushed it off, telling myself that I was probably reading too much into things. One evening, Sarah came home later than usual. I'd been trying to stay up for her, but by the time she walked through the door, it was nearly midnight. She looked surprised to see me waiting. "Oh, you're still up," she said, giving me a quick smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, I figured we could catch up." "You've been out a lot lately," I replied, keeping my tone light but feeling the tension build inside. She shrugged it off, claiming she was working on a big project with her team and that the hours were unavoidable. But something didn't add up. Her stories never lined up, and there was always an excuse, always some vague answer that left me with more questions. A few days later, I found myself scrolling through my texts, thinking of reaching out to Jake. Maybe he'd know if something was going on with Sarah at work, or if there was something stressing her out. But then, a thought crossed my mind that I couldn't shake. Could it be him? The idea felt absurd. Jake was my friend. Sarah was my wife. But as that suspicion grew, I couldn't ignore it anymore. As much as I tried to push the thought away, I couldn't shake it. The idea of Sarah and Jake together was ridiculous, or at least, that's what I wanted to believe. But once the suspicion was there, every little thing started looking like a sign. One evening, Sarah left her phone on the kitchen counter while she went to take a shower. I'd never felt the need to go through her phone before, but the curiosity, and maybe desperation, got the better of me. My hands were shaking as I picked it up, telling myself that if I didn't find anything, I'd never doubt her again. The phone was locked, and I didn't know her password. But as I put it down, I noticed a notification light up on the screen. It was a message from Jake. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." My stomach dropped. I stared at the message, reading it over and over, hoping I'd misunderstood or that there was some innocent explanation. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't a message a friend would send, not to my wife. I spent the next few days in a daze, trying to pretend everything was normal while my mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Why Jake? The friend I'd trusted, the man who knew everything about my life, my relationship. At night, I'd lie awake, replaying every moment I could think of, wondering how many times they'd lied to my face, how many times I'd been the clueless one, trusting them both. The weight of what I'd discovered became too much to carry alone. I needed answers, and I knew exactly where to start. The message I'd seen from Jake kept replaying in my mind, and no matter how I looked at it, there was no innocent explanation. A few days later, I called Jake up, keeping my voice as casual as I could manage. I asked if he wanted to grab a drink after work, pretending like I didn't know anything. He agreed without hesitation, probably assuming this would just be another hangout between friends. We met at a small bar we both liked, a place we'd gone to countless times before. As we sat down, I could barely look him in the eye, but I forced myself to stay calm. He seemed relaxed, laughing and chatting about work like everything was normal. But I wasn't here to play along. Finally, after a few minutes, I cut him off mid-sentence. "Jake, I need you to be honest with me about something." He raised an eyebrow, looking confused. "Of course, man. What's up?" I took a deep breath, gripping my drink a little tighter. "Are you seeing Sarah?" His face went pale, the easy smile vanishing instantly. For a moment, he said nothing, just staring at me as if he couldn't believe I'd asked. Then he looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "Mike, it's not what you think," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "We didn't mean for it to happen." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. He didn't deny it. There was no excuse, no attempt to lie. I felt a surge of anger and betrayal, emotions I could barely contain. "Not what I think," I said, my voice shaking. "Jake, you were my friend. How could you do this to me?" He looked down, guilt etched on his face. I don't know, man. It just happened. I didn't want it to, but," he trailed off, unable to finish, knowing there was nothing he could say to justify what he'd done. I stood up, unable to listen any longer. "I trusted you, Jake. And you threw it all away. Don't contact me again." Without waiting for his response, I walked out, leaving him sitting there alone with the mess he'd made. After the confrontation with Jake, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had to confront Sarah. Part of me hoped that she'd deny it, that maybe somehow Jake had lied or exaggerated. But deep down, I knew the truth. I just needed to hear it from her. That evening, I waited for Sarah to come home. She walked in, tired and smiling, like everything was fine. But when she saw me standing in the kitchen, arms crossed and face grim, her smile faded. "What's wrong?" she asked, putting down her bag. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sarah, I talked to Jake." For a split second, I saw a flash of panic in her eyes, but she quickly masked it. "Jake? What are you talking about?" "I know, Sarah," I said, the words coming out sharper than I'd intended. "I know about you too. He told me everything." Her face went pale, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked away, crossing her arms as if she could shield herself from what was happening. After a long silence, she finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I never meant for you to find out this way." "That's it?" I said, my anger breaking through. "That's all you have to say?" "I trusted you, Sarah. I trusted both of you. And this whole time, you were lying to my face." She looked down, and for the first time, I saw her carefully constructed mask slipping. I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did. Jake was there for me in ways you weren't. Her words stung, cutting deeper than any explanation could. She was turning it back on me, trying to justify what she'd done as if somehow, I was to blame. I shook my head, feeling a mix of anger, betrayal, and sadness. You know, I thought we had something real. But clearly, you were busy building something with my best friend behind my back. She was silent, unable to argue. And in that moment, I realized there was nothing left to say. The truth was out, and with it, the illusion of trust and love that I'd held onto for so long. Pack your things, Sarah, I said quietly, finally feeling the weight of the betrayal settle in. I'm done. As she stared at me, shock and regret in her eyes, I turned and walked away, leaving her to face the consequences of the choices she had made. After confronting Sarah, I needed time to process everything. She packed a few things that night and went to stay with her sister. The house felt quiet, almost empty, but the silence was better than the weight of betrayal lingering in the air. I spent the next few days going through the motions, barely eating or sleeping, just trying to make sense of how everything had unraveled so quickly. A part of me kept replaying her words, her attempt to shift the blame onto me by saying that Jake was there for her in ways I wasn't. That line hurt more than anything, as if she were trying to justify her betrayal by making me the problem. But the truth was simple, no matter what issues we'd had, she could have come to me, talked to me. Instead, she chose to keep secrets, to lie, to betray everything we had. I confided in my brother, Eric, about what had happened. He was shocked and furious on my behalf, offering support and reminding me that I deserved better. Talking to him helped, it reminded me that I wasn't alone and that I didn't have to carry this burden in silence. Meanwhile, I had to face the reality of losing two people at once. Jake and I had been close for years, he'd been like family to me. But now, the thought of him filled me with anger. How could he look me in the eye, share meals, laugh with me, all while betraying me with my own wife? A week later, Sarah tried to reach out, sending me long messages apologizing and asking for a chance to explain everything. She said she'd made a mistake, that she didn't want to lose me. But I couldn't bring myself to respond. The trust was gone, shattered beyond repair. For now, I was focused on moving forward. I didn't know what my life would look like from here, but I knew I couldn't stay in the past, trapped by betrayal. It was time to start picking up the pieces and rebuilding, without Sarah and without Jake. After the news of Sarah and Jake's betrayal spread among my close friends, they rallied around me in a way I hadn't expected. These were people who had known us as a couple, who had seen Jake and me as practically brothers. They were as stunned and angered as I was, and in their own way, they wanted to help me heal. But a few of them had something else in mind, justice. My friend Eric, who had been there for me since day one, approached me with an idea. Mike, he said, we're not letting them walk away from this without feeling the consequences. They did this behind your back, thinking they'd get away with it. I say we show them what betrayal feels like. At first, I wasn't sure. But Eric and a couple of close friends had already come up with a plan that was both calculated and harsh. The first part of the plan targeted Jake, whose reputation in his career was essential. Jake worked in a tight-knit industry, where trust and relationships were everything. My friends decided that we'd expose him for who he really was, but in a way that would leave a permanent mark on his reputation. They collected every bit of proof of his betrayal, texts between him and Sarah, dates he'd lied about spending with me when he was actually with her, and even photos of us all together during the time he was betraying me. They created a detailed email, laying out Jake's betrayal, framing it as a lesson in loyalty and trust. They sent it to his boss, colleagues, and clients, along with a message about how someone who would betray their closest friend like this could not be trusted professionally. The email painted a picture of a man who was willing to deceive anyone for his own gain, and in his field, trust was everything. By the end of the week, Jake had lost several clients and was put on probation at work, an embarrassing fall for someone who prided himself on his professionalism. As for Sarah, my friends knew she valued her social image and reputation in her circles. Eric had an idea to expose her, not just to her friends but to her family as well. Together, we created a carefully crafted family letter, addressed to her parents and siblings, detailing everything she had done with Jake, complete with proof. The letter explained the emotional pain she'd caused, not only to me but to the friends and family who had believed in her. It was a sobering look at the impact of her betrayal, and it shattered the carefully crafted image she had maintained. Her family was heartbroken and furious, and word spread quickly. Soon, everyone in her circle knew what she had done. The backlash was swift. Her friends distanced themselves, her family voiced their disappointment publicly, and her social circles no longer saw her as the charming, trustworthy person she'd pretended to be. She was left alone to deal with the fallout. Watching them both face the consequences was a kind of closure. They had deceived me, betrayed my trust, and taken my loyalty for granted. Now, they knew what it was like to lose everything, just as they had made me feel. After the initial fallout from Jake and Sarah's betrayal, I thought things would settle down. I figured they had felt enough of the consequences, and maybe now I could start moving forward. But my friends had a different plan. To them, Jake hadn't suffered nearly enough for his actions. They wanted to make sure he felt every ounce of the betrayal he had inflicted on me, and they were prepared to go even further to ensure he understood the full extent of his actions. Eric, who had spearheaded the first wave of payback, approached me one evening with a new plan. "Look, Mike, I know it's harsh, but people like Jake don't change unless they're forced to confront the truth. We're going to make sure he faces what he's done head-on. I've got an idea, but I'll need your permission." I wasn't sure what he had in mind, but the pain Jake and Sarah had caused was still fresh, so I agreed. The plan involved exposing Jake to the people he valued most, his own family and close friends, the ones who thought he was a trustworthy man. Eric and my other friends spent the next few days gathering more evidence and testimonials from mutual friends who had witnessed Jake's betrayal firsthand. They put everything together in a detailed letter, almost like a dossier, highlighting Jake's deceit and disloyalty, making it clear that this wasn't just a one-time mistake but a pattern of betrayal. Eric arranged to have the letter sent to Jake's family, including his parents, who were very proud of his professional achievements and held him in high regard. They would see firsthand the damage he'd caused not only to me but to everyone who had trusted him. But my friends didn't stop there. They planned one final move. They coordinated with a few key people in Jake's industry who were aware of his affair with my wife. These were colleagues who believed in professional ethics and had been disgusted by his actions. They managed to spread the word that Jake was not someone who could be trusted, not just in personal matters, but in professional ones, too. Within days, Jake's name in the industry had become toxic, and his reputation was shattered. No one wanted to associate with a man who betrayed his closest friends so callously. By the end of it all, Jake had lost everything he valued, his social circle, his professional reputation, and the respect of his own family. The consequences were brutal, and while part of me felt a pang of guilt for allowing things to go so far, I reminded myself that Jake's actions had left me in ruins. He'd taken my trust and crushed it, and now he was finally feeling what it was like to be on the other side of that betrayal. In the end, I knew that he had brought this on himself. And as I watched my friend stand by me through every step of it, I realized I was ready to leave the past behind for good. The revenge was complete, and it was time for me to move forward, free from the shadows of betrayal. As the fallout from my friend's revenge plans against Jake continued, I started noticing that Eric and a few others weren't ready to stop. They seemed almost energized by the results so far, and with each hit Jake took, they found new ways to make him suffer. What had started as a quest for justice had taken on a new life of its own, and I was here for it. One evening, Eric called me, his tone practically brimming with excitement. "Mike, we've got one more thing planned for Jake. He hasn't even felt the full consequences yet. We're going to make sure he remembers this for the rest of his life." "What do you mean, Eric?" I asked, feeling a surge of anticipation. "We've gotten in touch with some people at a couple of firms he's been applying to for work. Let's just say they're very aware of Jake's character issues now. Word is spreading fast, and it's only a matter of time before he finds himself blacklisted from the entire industry, he said, sounding almost proud. A grin spread across my face. This was beyond anything I could have planned myself, and it was perfect. Jake hadn't just betrayed me, he'd thrown away our friendship and destroyed my trust, thinking he could get away with it. Watching him face real consequences was exactly what he deserved. "Eric, you're a genius," I said, relishing the satisfaction in my voice. "I never would have thought of this, but honestly, this is exactly what he needs. He crossed a line, and it's about time he feels the weight of what he's done." Eric chuckled. "Glad you approve. He's not going to be able to rebuild his image, not after this. And, Mike, we're just getting started. We're going to make sure he can't just move on and pretend none of this happened." After the call ended, I leaned back, feeling a sense of relief and satisfaction I hadn't felt in a long time. Jake had brought this on himself, and my friends were ensuring he would feel every consequence. The next day, my friends updated me on their progress. Word was spreading fast in his professional circles, and Jake was quickly losing allies. People he'd counted on were distancing themselves, and his name was starting to carry a reputation no one wanted to be associated with. Knowing my friends were behind me in this, ensuring Jake would face every consequence of his actions, felt like closure in its own way. For the first time since all this began, I felt truly supported, knowing I had friends who'd go to any length to stand by me. Jake was finally facing what he deserved, and with my friends by my side, I could look toward the future without regret. After everything that had come to light, I knew what I needed to do next. The betrayal, the lies, the deception, it all led to one inevitable decision. It was time to move on from Sarah, to finally sever the ties that bound us. She'd made her choices, and now it was my turn to make mine. The next morning, I called my lawyer, David, a no-nonsense attorney who'd handled several tough cases for me in the past. When he picked up, I didn't waste any time. "David, I need you to prepare the divorce papers. I want to finalize this as quickly as possible, and I don't want Sarah walking away with anything." There was a pause on the other end as David processed what I was asking. He knew me well enough to understand that this wasn't a decision I'd made lightly. "Understood, Mike," he replied, his tone calm and professional. "And with the prenuptial agreement in place, that shouldn't be an issue. She agreed to limited assets if infidelity was involved, so this will work in our favor." The prenuptial agreement was something I'd insisted on before we got married, though back then, I'd never really thought it would come to this. It had felt like a formality, a safety net I'd never need. But now, it was my one line of defense against Sarah taking advantage of everything I'd worked so hard for. "Perfect," I said, feeling a sense of calm settle over me. "Make sure everything is airtight. I don't want her challenging this or finding a loophole." David reassured me. "With the evidence we have, she doesn't stand a chance. And given the prenup's terms, she'll walk away with only what's stated, and nothing more. I'll get everything started, and we'll arrange a meeting to go over the details." After hanging up, I felt a wave of relief. This was it, the beginning of the end. I wasn't just leaving Sarah, I was ensuring she faced the consequences of her actions without benefiting from our life together. The prenup was ironclad, and with David handling everything, I knew Sarah would be left with nothing. It wasn't revenge, it was justice. She'd betrayed me in the worst way possible, and now she'd have to face the outcome of her choices, alone. I sat back, letting the decision sink in, feeling stronger with every passing moment. This was the path forward, and I was ready to see it through. With the divorce process set in motion, I felt a weight begin to lift off my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace, knowing that soon, I'd be free from the betrayal that had taken over my life. But there was one thing left I needed to do before the court dates and final settlements: properly thank the people who had been there for me through it all. I called up Eric and a few of the other friends who'd stuck by me, the ones who'd helped me every step of the way. "Drinks are on me tonight," I said. We're celebrating. Meet me at the Oak Tavern at 8. They didn't need much convincing, and that evening, we gathered at the bar. The Oak Tavern was one of those cozy, dimly lit spots where we'd spent countless nights before everything fell apart. Tonight, though, the place felt different. It felt like a refuge, a place where I could finally breathe and enjoy myself with the people who mattered most. When we were all seated with drinks in hand, I raised my glass. I just want to say, I couldn't have done this without you guys, I said, looking around the table. You saw me through the darkest days, and I'll never forget that. With friends like you, I know I'll never be lost. Eric grinned, lifting his glass. Here's to new beginnings, and making sure Jake and Sarah get exactly what they deserve. Everyone laughed, clinking glasses, and just like that, the tension of the past few weeks melted away. We spent the night sharing stories, cracking jokes, and, of course, reminiscing about the small victories we'd achieved on the path to justice. It felt good to laugh again, to feel like myself. We toasted to true friendship, to loyalty, and to the future. My friends didn't hold back in showing their support, and I realized just how lucky I was to have them. They'd seen me at my worst, and instead of walking away, they'd gone out of their way to lift me back up. As the night wore on, the sense of betrayal and bitterness faded further into the background. I had people in my life who cared about me deeply, who'd shown their loyalty in ways I could never repay. With these friends by my side, I knew I could take on anything. We left the bar late that night, laughing and exchanging promises to meet up again soon. It was the best night I'd had in a long time, and as I walked home, I felt a sense of gratitude and peace settle over me. No matter what the future held, I knew I was surrounded by people who had my back. The day of the court hearing finally arrived. As I walked into the courthouse with my lawyer, David, by my side, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. Everything we'd prepared, everything I'd been through over the past few months, was coming to a close. Today, it would all be over. We entered the courtroom, and I saw Sarah sitting across the room. She looked tense, maybe even a little regretful, but I kept my gaze steady. This wasn't a time for second thoughts or hesitation. She'd made her choices, and now we were both here to see the consequences of those choices play out. The judge began by reviewing the evidence we'd submitted. David had everything carefully organized, from the prenuptial agreement to the documentation of her infidelity. The clear, irrefutable proof left little room for debate, and Sarah's lawyer could hardly make an argument. It was almost surreal watching her sit there, silent, as the reality of the agreement sank in. After a brief pause, the judge gave his ruling. Based on the terms of the prenuptial agreement and the evidence presented today, the court awards Mr. Michaels the full assets and property outlined in the document. Mrs. Michaels will receive only what was agreed upon in the event of marital infidelity. With that simple statement, the judge finalized it. I was officially divorced, and Sarah would walk away with next to nothing. The prenuptial agreement had done its job, ensuring that everything I'd worked for stayed with me. She wouldn't benefit from betraying me, and there was a sense of justice in that. As the hearing ended, Sarah shot me one last look, a mix of anger, regret, and maybe even desperation. But I just nodded, feeling no need to say anything more. The court had spoken, and now it was time for both of us to move on. Walking out of the courtroom, David shook my hand, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. Couldn't have gone any smoother, Mike. I think this chapter is well and truly closed. I thanked him, feeling a surge of relief and freedom wash over me. The weight I'd been carrying for so long was finally lifted. I was free, not just from Sarah and Jake's betrayal, but from the bitterness and hurt that had haunted me. As I stepped outside into the open air, I realized that this was it, the fresh start I'd been waiting for. I could finally focus on my future, on rebuilding my life, without the shadows of the past dragging me down. The divorce was done, and I was ready to move forward, stronger and wiser than before. The day after the court hearing, just when I thought everything was finally behind me, I received an unexpected call. It was David, my lawyer, and his tone was urgent. "Mike, I need you to come to my office as soon as possible. There's something you need to see." My heart skipped a beat. "Is something wrong with the divorce settlement?" I asked, worried that Sarah might have found a loophole to challenge the court's ruling. "No, it's not about the divorce," he replied. "But it's something significant." Curious and a little anxious, I headed to David's office. When I arrived, he was waiting with a thick file on his desk. He motioned for me to sit down, his expression unreadable. "Mike, after yesterday's ruling, I thought everything was wrapped up. But this morning, something unexpected came to my attention." He opened the file and handed me a document. "Sarah's finances. It turns out she's been hiding something that might be of interest to you." As I looked over the document, my eyes widened. It was a series of bank statements, showing multiple large transfers between Sarah's account and Jake's. The dates matched the timeline of our marriage, right up to a few weeks before the court hearing. The transfers weren't small, they were significant amounts, enough to raise serious questions. "Are you saying Sarah was funneling money to Jake behind my back?" I asked, still in shock. David nodded. "It looks that way. And these transactions suggest she was likely using your shared funds, your earnings, to support him, even while they were seeing each other. She essentially siphoned off thousands of dollars to support Jake financially." A wave of anger hit me, stronger than anything I'd felt before. It was one thing for her to betray me emotionally, but financially? Using the money I'd worked hard for to support her affair. This was beyond anything I'd imagined. David's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "Since this was uncovered post-divorce, you have grounds to file a separate legal case against her for financial misconduct. It could force her to pay back every cent she took, and there could even be criminal consequences." I felt a strange sense of satisfaction at this new revelation. Just when I thought Sarah and Jake had gotten away with everything, here was another chance to make sure they faced the consequences. I looked at David, my mind made up. "Let's go after it. I want every cent back." The final chapter wasn't over yet, and now, Sarah and Jake were about to face a whole new level of accountability for their betrayal. With the new evidence in hand, David and I laid out a plan. This time, it wasn't just about closing the door on my marriage with Sarah, it was about holding her accountable for every single dollar she'd funneled to Jake behind my back. The betrayal had run deep, but this? This was a different kind of theft, one that had real legal implications. We filed a motion against Sarah for financial misconduct, citing unauthorized use of joint funds. David assured me that with the bank statements and transfer records, our case was solid. Not only could we seek reimbursement, but there was also a possibility of criminal charges if we could prove intent to deceive and misuse our shared assets. A few days later, Sarah received notice of the new case. I could almost imagine the shock on her face as she read through the allegations, realizing that this wasn't over. Just when she thought she'd walked away with her pride intact, she now had to face the possibility of not only losing financially but also facing legal repercussions. To make things even more intense, David and I had another surprise lined up. We'd subpoenaed Jake as a witness. We wanted him on record, testifying about those transactions. The strategy was simple: if Jake lied, it would be considered perjury. If he told the truth, he'd expose himself and Sarah even further. A week later, the day of the hearing arrived, and both Sarah and Jake showed up, looking visibly nervous. I felt a strange sense of satisfaction as I took my seat, knowing that this was the final stand. They couldn't dodge or twist their way out of this one. The judge began by reviewing the evidence, and David presented the detailed records of every transaction Sarah had made to Jake. Each one hit like a hammer, showing exactly how Sarah had siphoned funds, little by little, to support her affair. The courtroom was silent as David finished, the weight of the evidence unmistakable. Then it was Jake's turn to testify. He looked uneasy as he took the stand, glancing over at Sarah, who avoided his gaze. When David began questioning him about the transactions, Jake stammered, clearly panicking. He tried to give vague answers, but David kept pressing, showing him each bank statement, each transfer, until there was nowhere left to hide. Finally, Jake cracked, admitting that Sarah had sent him the money and that he'd accepted it, knowing full well where it had come from. He tried to excuse it, saying they'd never meant for it to hurt anyone, but his words rang hollow in the silent courtroom. By the end of the hearing, the judge ruled in our favor, ordering Sarah to repay every cent she had taken, and making it clear that if she didn't, criminal charges could be filed. As I left the courtroom that day, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't experienced before. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore, it was about justice, about finally putting an end to everything Sarah and Jake had done. They'd tried to take everything from me, but in the end, they were left with nothing but the mess they'd made. I walked away, feeling lighter, knowing that I'd fought back and won. Now, I could finally move forward, leaving them to deal with the consequences of their own actions. The chapter was truly closed, and for the first time, I was ready for a new beginning. The court battles were finally over, and the weight of it all had lifted. Sarah and Jake were now left to pick up the pieces of the mess they'd created, their reputations and finances in ruins. The satisfaction of seeing justice served was more fulfilling than I'd imagined, but even more so was the feeling of freedom I now had, a clean slate, an open road ahead. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into rebuilding. I reconnected with friends and family, spent time on things I'd set aside, and began picking up hobbies I'd long forgotten about. My life was mine again, untainted by betrayal and lies, and I was determined to make it something I could be proud of. Eric and my other friends stood by me, and one evening as we gathered, he raised a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, grinning. "No more looking back, just forward from here on out." I raised my glass, grateful for the friends who had been my true family through everything. Without their support, I might have been lost in the darkness of it all. But they'd pulled me up, fought by my side, and reminded me of my own strength. As the months went by, I found myself thinking of Sarah and Jake less and less. Their actions had once dominated my thoughts, but now, they were just part of a closed chapter, part of a past I no longer carried with me. I realized that, in the end, their betrayal had taught me something invaluable, that I deserved honesty, loyalty, and people who genuinely cared. One afternoon, as I sat on my porch, feeling the warmth of the sun, I took a deep breath, and a sense of peace washed over me. I was free, unburdened, and for the first time in a long time, truly happy. The road ahead was mine to shape, and I knew, with certainty, that the best was yet to come.